Rain slicked the streets, making neon reflections shiver like broken glass. Officer Daniels sat behind the wheel of his cruiser, exhaustion pressing his eyelids down like lead, and his German shepherd, Coda, huddled beside him, trembling not from cold but from the quiet weight of fear and confusion. The diner receipt fluttered on the dashboard. Another $0 tip. Another anonymous sting that cut sharper than the sirens outside. He stared at it, heart sinking, remembering the mounting bills, the nights Coda went hungry beside him, the endless cycle of calls that left him invisible to everyone but this dog. The diner's hum, a low static in the background, seemed to whisper that someone somewhere had forgotten him, forgotten them both. And yet as the wipers dragged streaks of rain across the windshield, something caught his eye beneath the receipt. A folded scrap of paper, damp at the edges, scrawled in hurried handwriting. Coda's ears perked. His tail thumped once against the vinyl seat. In that small moment, the despair in Daniel's chest tangled with a flicker of curiosity and hope. The note smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, but it carried a promise that would unravel everything he thought he knew about being seen, being valued, and being needed. The rain had started early that evening, light and tentative at first. A mist that brushed against the city like fingertips over skin. By the time Officer Daniels parked his cruiser outside the diner, the drizzle had turned into a steady, rhythmic pour, smacking against the windshield in uneven bursts. The wipers thrashed back and forth, unable to keep up with the chaotic beat of the weather. Daniels leaned back in his seat, the leather stiff under his coat, and exhaled a long, shaky breath that fogged the glass before him. Beside him, Coda, his German shepherd, pressed close, resting his warm head on Daniel's thigh. The dog's fur, slick from the rain during their patrol, still carried the faint scent of wet asphalt and old pine from the wooded trails they'd passed earlier. Daniel scratched behind Coda's ears, feeling the tension in the dog's muscles, the silent way he mirrored his own exhaustion. Coda's eyes were bright, intelligent, and infinitely patient, holding the quiet loyalty of a companion who had seen every late-night worry, every moment of doubt, every cold meal eaten in the solitude of a police cruiser. The diner lights cast a warm golden glow that seeped through the rain, painting the street in long fractured reflections. Daniels watched the neon open sign buzz above the doorway, its flickering hum competing with the constant rhythm of the rain. The diner had become a refuge of sorts over the last few weeks, a place where he could sit and feel the world move on without him. It was a tiny reprieve from the endless grind of precinct paperwork, the deafening calls over the radio, the invisible weight of responsibility that no one outside the badge ever seemed to notice. Tonight, like so many nights before, he had eaten quickly, picking at a plate of eggs and toast and left nothing behind. Not out of malice or neglect, but simply because his heart felt heavy and empty. The receipt lay on the dashboard now, a tiny white rectangle that seemed to mock him in the dim light. A $0 tip. Another anonymous sting, a reminder that kindness sometimes skipped him entirely. Daniels felt a hollow thrum in his chest, a pang that stretched across every rib, sinking him further into the melancholy that had been creeping in for weeks. He thought about Coda's empty water dish at home, the stack of bills waiting for payment, the frayed edges of his patience and spirit, and a bitterness settled over him, thick as the rain outside. Coda nudged his hand, a soft, insistent reminder that he was not alone. Daniels turned to meet his gaze, and the dog's amber eyes held a quiet question, almost a plea. Are you giving up too soon? Daniels wanted to shake his head, to reassure himself that the world hadn't entirely forgotten them, but his lips remained sealed. Instead, he reached down and stroked Coda's muzzle, feeling the coarse bristles against his fingertips, the warmth of life in the midst of the cold, wet night. The dog's tail thumped once against the seat, a single heartbeat of encouragement. In that small gesture, Daniels felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in days. Hope. His gaze drifted to the receipt again, and something underneath it caught his eye. A corner of paper, folded and damp, peeking out from beneath the fragile rectangle. Daniels lifted the receipt carefully, feeling the rain-soaked edges tear slightly under his fingers. Beneath it, the note was scrawled in hurried handwriting, jagged but legible. The words were simple, almost cryptic, but they carried an immediate weight, a promise of purpose in a life that had felt increasingly hollow. Daniel's pulse quickened. a mixture of disbelief and cautious curiosity coiling in his chest. He glanced at Coda, who now sat upright, ears pricked, tail stiff with alertness, sensing the gravity of the moment. The dog's instincts, honed over years of service and countless patrols, were already engaged. Daniel's fingers tightened around the note, the texture of the damp paper pressing against his skin like a lifeline. The diner's warmth seemed distant now, almost irrelevant, replaced by the pulse of the city outside and the sharp clarity of a task that was suddenly his to unravel. Coda shifted, brushing his side against Daniel's, a reminder that they were in this together, partners not just in law enforcement, but in survival, in endurance, in quiet, unnoticed heroism. Daniels could feel the dog's heartbeat through the taut muscles of his chest, and it echoed his own, creating a rhythm that seemed to push back against the rain and the darkness and the sense of invisibility that had been pressing on him like a heavy coat. The streets beyond the diner were slick with rain, reflecting the neon in fractured, trembling pools. Cars passed in a blur, their headlights casting sharp angles across the wet asphalt. The smell of wet pavement, gasoline, and faint smoke from the diner's kitchen wrapped around them, grounding Daniels in the moment. He tucked the note into his coat pocket, careful not to let it fall, and started the engine. The cruiser hummed to life, the radio crackling with static in the background, a faint reminder of the world he was sworn to protect even as it often failed to notice him. Coda's eyes never left the paper in Daniel's hand, and the officer knew without words that the dog understood the shift in momentum, the call to action, the unspoken promise that something beyond the monotony of ignored heroism awaited them. As they pulled out into the rain-slicked streets, Daniels felt a strange mixture of anxiety and anticipation twisting in his stomach. The $0 tip, the crushing exhaustion, the loneliness that had shadowed him for weeks, all of it seemed to gather in a tight knot and then, slowly, unravel as he followed the invisible trail the note promised. Coda's ears twitched with every sound, the splash of tires, the clatter of a distant trash can, the drip of water from the rooftops, and Daniels realized in that moment that he had never been alone. Not really. Not with Coda by his side, not with the quiet pull of purpose whispering through a scrap of paper. The rain continued to fall, steady and insistent, but now it sounded less like a lament and more like a drumbeat, urging them forward. Every turn they made, every street they passed, carried with it the electric tension of the unknown. Daniel's mind raced with questions. Who had left the note? Why them? What did they want? And yet beneath the fear and doubt, beneath the layers of fatigue and worry, a single truth began to take root. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment when their lives, his and Coda's, would finally pivot from survival to significance. The rain fell, relentless and raw, a curtain against which their small figures moved with purpose, and in that movement, Daniels felt the fragile stirrings of hope, the first flickers of belief that the world had not entirely overlooked them. He glanced at Coda again, and the dog's eyes met his, steady and unwavering, a mirror of courage and loyalty. The note in his pocket seemed to vibrate with possibility, a pulse that synchronized with the steady thrum of the cruiser and the soft, constant patter of rain. Daniels took a deep breath, tasting the wet electric air, letting it fill his lungs and sharpen his senses. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing with certainty. He would not face it alone. Not with Coda, not with the spark of purpose, not with the quiet, insistent hope that now guided each careful, deliberate movement. The city around them blurred in streaks of light and shadow, the rain casting the world in shifting, cinematic patterns, and Daniels felt the first true weight of possibility in weeks. A sense of being seen, of being needed, of being alive. And in that rain-soaked moment with Coda at his side, he felt the story begin, fragile, urgent, and filled with the promise of redemption. The streets were quiet now, though not entirely empty. Rain had dulled the city's usual cacophony, leaving behind a world of distant echoes, the occasional squeal of tires, the muted hum of neon signs reflected in puddles, the drip, drip, drip of water sliding off fire escapes. Daniels drove slowly, Coda perched alertly beside him, ears swiveling toward every sound, muscles coiled like springs under his wet coat. The note, tucked safely in Daniels' pocket, burned against his chest, a simple set of instructions that seemed impossibly precise. Follow the alley past the third street lamp, look for what waits. His mind ran in loops, questions ricocheting off each other. Yet beneath the chatter, a single thread of purpose ran taut. Someone out there needed them. Coda's low growl as a trash can rattled in a side alley reminded Daniels that the dog was already scanning the shadows, smelling things humans could not, seeing movement that escaped the eye. The first alley appeared exactly as the note had indicated. Narrow, littered with wet cardboard and broken glass. Its walls slick with rain and graffiti. It swallowed sound and light, leaving the pair in a muted world of dripping darkness. Daniels exhaled slowly, tasting the damp air, the sharp metallic tang of water running over asphalt, and felt Coda stiffen beside him. The dog's body was a perfect blend of alertness and calm, every sense tuned to the rhythm of the city's hidden life. Daniels slid the cruiser forward slowly, keeping an eye on the shadows, heart hammering not just from fear, but from anticipation, the tension of a mystery unfolding, a story waiting to be claimed. As they rounded the corner, a sudden noise made Daniels freeze. A tin can rolling across the alley, clattering against the wall. Coda's hackles rose slightly, but there was no panic, only calculated attention. The dog sniffed the air, then glanced back at Daniels, and in that glance, the officer felt the full measure of their partnership. Trust instinct and silent communication honed through years of patrols, emergencies, and long, lonely nights. Coda knew the city differently than Daniels did. He felt it through the vibrations in the wet ground, the subtle shifts in the wind, the faint traces of scent that told stories of who had passed this way, what they carried, and what they wanted. Daniels marveled, as he often did, at the depth of intelligence and loyalty compressed into Coda's thick, dark coat and amber eyes. They continued, step by step, following the invisible thread the note had set. Rain dripped from Daniels' collar onto the dashboard, and the windshield wiper's constant sweep sounded like a heartbeat, a companion to the quiet thrum of Coda's pads against the wet pavement. Bang! Every shadow seemed to twitch, every distant noise exaggerated in the emptiness. Daniel's mind wandered briefly to the people he had saved before, crimes solved, lives protected. But tonight was different. This was intimate, personal. The note's author had chosen him, and with that choice came weight and responsibility. Coda's tail swished once against Daniel's leg, a small punctuation mark in the dark, and the officer felt the subtle pull of courage that only a companion like this could inspire. Halfway down the alley, they encountered their first obstacle, a gate, rusted shut, half covered in ivy. Daniels hesitated, tugging at the damp metal, then looked to Coda. The dog's gaze was steady, almost challenging, a silent command, find a way. Daniels crouched, feeling the soaked concrete under his knees, the rough rust biting at his gloves, and realized that this night demanded more than simple obedience. Coda's nose twitched at the air, picking up a scent that Daniels could not follow, guiding the officer to a loose plank near the gate's base. With careful effort, Daniels shifted it aside, enough to create a gap. Coda slipped through first, graceful and sure, then Daniels followed, wet and chilled but propelled by purpose. The city's silence swallowed them, and for a moment, all that existed was this alley, this mission, and the palpable connection between man and dog. Further on, the alley opened into a courtyard, puddles reflecting the fragmented neon above. Daniel's eyes darted nervously, but Coda remained calm, ears forward, scanning, sniffing, alert. There was movement, a shadow slipping behind a dumpster, and Coda reacted instantly, muscles coiling like a spring, eyes fixed. Daniels held his breath, heart lodged somewhere between fear and awe. The shadow revealed itself as a stray cat, skittish and wild-eyed, disappearing into a corner, leaving behind only the echo of its claws against concrete. Coda relaxed slightly, glancing back at Daniels, reassuring him without words. The dog's presence grounded the officer, reminded him that fear could be managed, that caution could coexist with courage. They moved on, following the note's instructions through twisting paths and hidden corridors, each step amplifying the tension. The city smelled different at night, Daniels noticed. The damp concrete, the faint smoke from a distant chimney, the coppery scent of rain in the gutter. Each sensory detail etched itself into his memory, sharpening him, heightening his awareness. Coda's body pressed against his side as they passed a broken lamppost, a silent signal that the dog had picked up another scent. Daniels leaned closer, catching the faint hint of something familiar yet urgent. A trace of paper, the smell of ink, a signal that they were on the right track. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of dark streets, twisted alleys, and silent, cautious movements, they arrived at a small door, half hidden behind a stack of crates. Daniel's hand shook slightly as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was warm, thick with dust and the scent of old wood. The faint light from a single hanging bulb flickered, revealing a cluttered room, its walls lined with cages and makeshift bedding. Daniels froze, taking in the scene. Several frightened animals, dogs, cats, a few birds, huddled together, their eyes wide, uncertain, desperate. And then he understood. The note had led him here. Someone had trusted him, believed in him that he could make a difference. Koda moved ahead cautiously, sniffing the air, his presence immediately calming the frightened animals. Daniels knelt, feeling the floor's cold concrete beneath him, and extended a hand, unsure but determined. The first dog, a small mutt shivering in the corner, approached slowly, tail wagging hesitantly. Koda nuzzled the mutt gently, establishing trust through example. Daniels felt tears prick the back of his eyes, an emotional swell he hadn't allowed himself in weeks. This was why he endured the exhaustion, the loneliness, the $0 tips. This was why Koda was more than a partner. He was a bridge between fear and safety, between isolation and connection. Hours passed in a blur as Daniels and Koda assessed the situation, organizing the frightened animals, giving them water, offering warmth. Each movement, each touch, each soft word from Daniels was mirrored by Koda's precise, deliberate actions. The dog guided, protected, reassured, while Daniels followed instinct and heart. The room's atmosphere shifted slowly from tension to cautious hope, the first flicker of light in what had seemed like a night without end. Daniels understood, finally, that this night was not about him or the invisible weight he carried. It was about responding, protecting, and trusting that his skills and his dog's instincts could change lives, even in a tiny, hidden corner of the world. Outside, the rain began to ease, leaving the streets slick but quieter, the world waiting, patient and observant. Daniels leaned back against the wall, exhausted but alive, Koda at his side, chest heaving, ears twitching to every sound, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. For the first time that night, Daniels allowed himself to believe that purpose was not something found in grand gestures or applause, but in moments like this, quiet, intimate, life-affirming. The note, the chase through dark streets, the hidden sanctuary of fear and hope, it all coalesced into a single truth. Together, he and Koda could face the unknown, confront danger, and bring comfort where it was most needed. The city outside continued its muted rhythm, but within that hidden room, under the soft hum of a single flickering bulb, Daniels and Koda felt the surge of meaning, the resonance of a partnership forged in sweat, rain, and quiet, unwavering trust. And as the German shepherd pressed close, head resting against Daniels' arm, tail thumping lightly in reassurance, the officer realized that the night's journey was only the beginning. The darkness they had navigated was not simply physical, it was emotional, a mirror of their own hidden struggles. And now, guided by instinct, loyalty, and a shared sense of purpose, they had begun to emerge into something brighter, something that might finally illuminate both their lives. The door creaked on its hinges as Daniels pushed it open, the sound cutting through the silence like a warning bell. Koda pressed close to his side, muscles coiled, ears twitching at every faint noise that reverberated in the dimly lit room beyond. The air smelled of damp wood, old paper, and something else, faint but unmistakable, fear. The kind of fear that clings to bodies like a second skin, curling into bones, saturating every breath. Daniel stepped inside cautiously, rainwater dripping from his shoulders, soaking into the seams of his uniform. Koda's paws made almost no sound on the cracked concrete floor, each step deliberate, measured, scanning, alert. It was a space that felt abandoned and alive at the same time, walls lined with makeshift cages, bedding and the remnants of hurried lives left behind. Shadows shifted in the corners, creatures pressing themselves into darkness, observing, waiting. At first, Daniels didn't see them clearly. Then the figures emerged, tentative, fragile. Children huddled together, small bodies pressed against one another for warmth, their eyes wide with the kind of terror that no adult should ever witness. And around them, animals, dogs, cats, even birds, trembled, noses pressed to the bars of cages or the edges of crates. The room was a world unto itself, suspended between despair and hope, waiting for someone to cross the threshold and validate its existence. Daniels felt his chest tighten. The note had been right. He was needed here. But seeing it with his own eyes, feeling the thick tension that wrapped around the air, he realized the weight of the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. Coda moved first, naturally, instinctively, slipping between the children and animals with the gentle authority of someone who understood fear. He sniffed, nudged, and barked softly, careful not to startle, and immediately a ripple of trust began to form. The children's wide eyes followed him, tracking his every movement, and one little boy took a hesitant step forward, a trembling hand extended as if to measure whether this new creature could be trusted. Coda allowed the touch, leaning his head into the palm, eyes soft, calm, aware. Daniels exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The room seemed to exhale with him. In Coda's actions, Daniel saw the bridge between human and animal, between terror and safety, between isolation and connection. The dog's presence was an anchor, grounding the frightened in a world that had been unrelentingly cruel. Daniels approached slowly, knees bent, arms slightly extended, careful not to appear threatening. He could feel the dampness of the floor through his boots, the weight of exhaustion in his muscles, the tight coil of adrenaline in his chest. The children flinched at first, but Coda's calm authority guided them forward. Daniels spoke softly, words deliberate and measured, offering reassurance that seemed fragile but somehow sufficient. "It's okay. You're safe now. You're not alone." He saw the smallest nods, the slight relaxation of shoulders, the hesitant curiosity glimmering in dark eyes. Coda moved in tandem, nose brushing the children's hands, tail swishing with measured calm, a tactile demonstration of safety and trust. The room was filled with a low hum of breathing, the occasional whimper of an animal, the shuffle of small feet on concrete. Daniels noticed the children's eyes, wide and glimmering with uncertainty, reflected the same awe he had felt when first meeting Coda years ago. The dog was more than a partner. He was a teacher, a healer, a living proof of loyalty and courage. Daniel's hand shook as he reached to remove a small bird from its cage, cradling it gently, the creature trembling but responsive to the warmth of his palms. Coda nudged closer, keeping watch, ready to act if anything threatened, embodying a protective vigilance that Daniels had learned to rely upon through countless nights of patrol. As he moved through the room, Daniels began to understand the layers of neglect, fear, and courage present. These children and animals had been abandoned or forgotten, left to navigate darkness and uncertainty. And now, guided by a note left by someone who saw his potential, he had the opportunity to intervene, to validate their existence, to offer care, attention, and safety. Each step forward carried both the weight of responsibility and the spark of hope. He whispered reassurances, distributed blankets, and offered small gestures, water, soft words, gentle hands, that cumulatively began to alter the energy of the room. Coda mirrored every action with precision, soft whines and gentle nudges establishing a rhythm of comfort that even Daniel's words could not achieve alone. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes and days all at once. Daniels noticed how Coda moved among the animals, how his presence encouraged hesitant tails to wag, how his careful gaze convinced the children that trust was not just a word, but a tangible reality. The officer felt a deep stirring in his chest, a realization that this night was reshaping not only the lives of those around him, but his own. He had spent weeks in quiet despair, feeling unseen, unappreciated, unnoticed. But here, in the glow of a single bulb, in the wet scent of animals and the timid murmur of children, he understood the truth. The smallest gestures could ripple into profound change. Coda, in every movement, every nudge, every soft gaze, exemplified this truth. Daniels paused for a moment, leaning against a wall, exhausted but alive. He could hear Coda's steady breathing, feel the warmth of the dog's body against his side, and realized that this partnership had become more than work. It was purpose incarnate. The children were beginning to smile, hesitant but genuine, as trust began to replace fear. One of the dogs, a scrappy terrier, tentatively approached Daniels, nudging his hand with a wet nose, and he laughed softly, a sound that had been absent from his life for weeks. Coda wagged his tail in approval, nudging the terrier gently, reinforcing the lesson that kindness, patience, and presence could heal even the deepest wounds. Outside, the night pressed on, rain pattering faintly against the roof, echoing the rhythm of their hearts. Daniels noticed small details, the glint of water on rusted metal, the soft murmur of distant traffic, the way shadows shifted with every flicker of the bulb overhead. Each sensation, each observation, grounded him in the moment, reinforcing the fragile but undeniable thread of connection between him, Coda, and the room of fragile lives. They were slowly transforming. The note that had brought him here seemed almost miraculous in retrospect, a simple message that had unraveled the inertia of despair, igniting courage, vigilance, and compassion in equal measure. As the hours waned, Daniels felt a profound shift within himself. The invisible weight of neglect, the loneliness, the quiet ache of unrecognized service, all of it had been replaced by purpose. Coda rested briefly beside him, tail flicking gently, ears alert but relaxed, eyes reflecting the soft glow of the bulb. Daniels met his gaze and realized that the dog had not just guided him here physically, but had led him emotionally, reminding him of the profound power of presence, empathy, and action. In that shared silence, he understood the heart of their work: to see, to protect, to act, to comfort. That was the real measure of heroism, not applause or recognition, but the quiet transformations wrought in lives often overlooked. By the time dawn approached, the room had shifted from tense, fearful, and cold to warm, calm, and alive. The children and animals had settled into a fragile rhythm of trust. Daniels felt the weight of exhaustion press down, but it was a different exhaustion now, one tempered by fulfillment and purpose rather than despair. Coda lay close, resting his head on Daniel's knee, tail flicking lazily in quiet satisfaction. Daniels knew, deep in his chest, that this was only the beginning. Whatever darkness lay ahead, whatever challenges awaited, they would face them together. Guided by instinct, loyalty, and the unspoken bond that had carried them through countless nights, they had crossed a threshold, not only into a physical space, but into a new realm of courage, connection, and human-animal partnership. In the quiet moments before sunrise, Daniels allowed himself to breathe fully, to take in the room, the children, the animals, the dog who had become his compass. The note tucked safely in his pocket had led him here, yes, but it was Coda's unwavering presence, trust, and vigilance that had made the transformation possible. And as light slowly filtered through the cracked windows, painting the walls in muted gold and soft shadows, Daniels understood the truth in a way he never had before. Every heartbeat mattered, every life deserved attention, and every act of courage, no matter how small, could ripple outward, changing the course of countless stories, including his own. The air had changed. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the streets glistening like black glass, each puddle reflecting the muted neon of a waking city. But inside, tension coiled tight around Daniel's chest like a rope, knotting with every heartbeat. He could sense it before he saw it, a subtle shift in the animals, the children pressing closer together, Coda's ears pricked, body stiff, muscles tense like springs ready to release. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was a warning. A low, almost imperceptible sound reached Daniel's ears, the groan of timber under strain, a whisper of movement that didn't belong. He glanced at Coda, and the German shepherd's amber eyes met his, pupils wide, nostrils flaring. The dog's stance was rigid, a masterclass in alertness honed through years of service, each muscle ready to act. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the floorboards above cracked sharply. Dust fell in thin streams, tickling his skin and filling the room with the metallic tang of imminent danger. "A Coda," he whispered, voice barely audible, yet firm. The dog responded instantly, a soft growl vibrating in his throat, a reminder of instinct and training merging seamlessly. They moved as one, silent but precise, weaving through the room with fluid grace. Daniels could feel the weight of responsibility settle heavier than ever before. Lives depended on them, and in Coda's unwavering presence, he found both courage and clarity. The threat became unmistakable in an instant. A ceiling beam above had cracked too far, a stack of crates teetering ominously. Daniel's mind raced, calculating the potential collapse, the panic it would incite among the children and animals, but there was no hesitation. He moved first, guiding the children with deliberate calm, every word measured to prevent hysteria. "To stay close. Follow me." We moved together. Coda swept ahead, his nose to the ground, tail signaling direction, a living, breathing compass of instinct. The animals, sensing his authority, mirrored his motion, their bodies weaving through the chaos with an almost mystical obedience. Daniels marveled, even in the heightened danger, at the symbiosis between man and dog, the precision, the understanding, the wordless communication that made them formidable together. A crate tipped suddenly, spilling a scattering of old blankets across the floor. Coda lunged, nudging it back upright with ease, clearing a path for the children to pass. Daniels lifted a frightened child, wrapping an arm around her small frame, feeling her trembling settle slightly as she caught Coda's reassuring gaze. Every motion was punctuated by the creak of weakening floorboards, the sharp scent of damp timber, and the faint echo of water dripping somewhere in the shadows. The room, once a haven, was transforming into a maze of peril, and yet Daniels felt the strange exhilaration of control amidst uncertainty. He was alive in a way he hadn't allowed himself in weeks, each second alive with the raw pulse of responsibility and instinct. As they approached the exit, a sudden groan resounded behind them. A beam had begun to fall. Daniel's heart thudded violently in his chest. Without thought, Coda pushed forward, intercepting a panicked dog that had broken from its crate, guiding it toward safety. Daniels followed immediately, scooping up a child as the beam splintered and fell with a deafening crash, sending shards of wood and dust into the air. The room became chaos incarnate. Shouts, barks, the scurry of terrified animals, the sharp scent of splintering wood, and wet concrete mingling into a tangible tension. Daniel's muscles burned, his lungs seized with adrenaline, but he moved, every step intentional, every heartbeat a countdown toward safety. They reached the doorway, and Daniels paused only to sweep one last glance at the room. The fear, the trembling, the fragile trust, it all pressed at him with a sudden intensity. Coda was already at the threshold, stance unwavering, ears swiveling to catch the faintest sound of danger. Daniels felt a surge of awe and gratitude, realizing once again that this dog, this loyal, intelligent creature, was more than a partner. He was a lifeline. With a final nod, Daniels guided the children and remaining animals through the doorway, one careful step after another, as if each motion stitched safety into the fabric of the moment. Outside, the night air was damp and cool, washing over them in sharp contrast to the suffocating tension inside. The children clung close, eyes wide with lingering fear, but a flicker of trust had begun to take root. The animals huddled together, Coda moving through the group with a watchful precision, ensuring that no one lagged, that every trembling paw or foot was guided safely. Daniel's chest heaved, muscles trembling from exertion, but his mind had never felt clearer. The chaos inside had been transformed into order outside, not by chance, but by the careful, unwavering coordination between him and his German shepherd. He knelt briefly to adjust a child's coat, feeling the faint tremor of relief pass through her small body. Coda pressed his head against Daniel's arm, eyes scanning the perimeter, still alert even in apparent safety. Daniels allowed himself a small, shaky smile. They had survived the immediate danger, yes, but more importantly, they had begun to knit together a fragile network of trust and courage, demonstrating in real time the impact of vigilance, patience, and unwavering loyalty. The night was no longer just a test of endurance. It was a testament to resilience, to the bond between man and dog, and to the quiet heroism that often goes unseen. A distant siren reminded Daniels of the world beyond this hidden alley, the city continuing in its relentless rhythm, unaware of the lives transformed in a dim, rain-slicked courtyard. Yet he felt no isolation now. Coda remained at his side, ears flicking to every sound, tail swishing once in reassurance, a heartbeat of certainty in the surrounding uncertainty. Daniels exhaled deeply, letting the cool night air fill his lungs, tasting wet concrete and faint pine, feeling alive in a way that he hadn't permitted himself for weeks. The children were beginning to relax, small smiles breaking through the shadows of fear, tentative laughter threading its way through the damp night air. Daniels noticed one of the animals, a frightened terrier, tentatively pawing at a blanket Coda, had nudged toward it. The dog nudged back gently, enforcing the lesson of trust, patience, and safety. Daniels felt tears prick the corner of his eyes. Raw, unfiltered, and emotional release that carried the weight of exhaustion, relief, and awe. The note had led them here, yes, but it was Coda's unwavering guidance and instinct that had ensured their survival. Every move, every glance, every calculated step had been life-saving. Daniels took a deep breath, letting the tension drain slowly, the adrenaline still thrumming in his veins, the satisfaction of purpose settling into his chest. He allowed himself to lean briefly against a wall, Coda at his side, ears still alert but body relaxed enough to exude quiet assurance. The mission, the fear, the peril, they had navigated it together. They had transformed chaos into safety, fear into trust and uncertainty into quiet, resilient. And as the first rays of dawn began to pierce the horizon, brushing the rain-slicked streets with pale gold, Daniels realized something he had not felt in a long time, a profound, unshakable certainty that he and Coda together could face anything. The night's danger had not been simply an obstacle. It had been a crucible, forging their partnership into something unbreakable, something capable of reaching into the lives of those who needed them most. Coda nuzzled his hand, tail thumping softly, and Daniels allowed himself a long, steadying breath. They had crossed the threshold of fear and emerged into purpose. And the resonance of that victory, the quiet triumph of loyalty, courage, and trust, would echo far beyond the night-shadowed streets. The first light of morning seeped through cracked blinds, painting the room in muted shades of gold and gray. Outside, the city was stirring, unaware of the quiet revolution that had taken place in a small, hidden corner of its streets. Daniel sat on the edge of a worn wooden crate, Coda beside him, head resting on his knee, eyes alert yet calm. The tension that had gripped the night was gone, replaced by a heavy, exhausted tranquility. The children and animals were slowly settling into a fragile rhythm, their trembling bodies finally learning what trust felt like. Daniel's hands, calloused and weary, brushed over Coda's fur, feeling the warmth, the life, the loyalty radiating from him. In this moment, he realized that their bond had become something beyond companionship. It was a lifeline, a tether to hope, a bridge over the abyss of despair that had shadowed him for so long. The note that had led him here now rested on the crate beside him. Damp edges curling slightly in the warmth of the room. Its words were simple, almost cryptic, yet they had guided him with an almost prescient precision. You are needed. Coda will know. Daniels had spent the night unraveling the mystery behind those words, navigating the treacherous balance of fear, responsibility, and instinct. And now he understood. Someone had observed him, noticed the quiet heroism he had begun to believe was invisible, and had entrusted him with a mission that was deeply personal. The realization struck him with a mixture of awe and humility. For the first time in weeks, he felt seen, not for accolades, not for recognition, but for the raw, unfiltered work he had done to protect and save lives. Coda lifted his head, ears swiveling at the faint stirrings of movement outside. Daniels followed the dog's gaze and saw the children, now cautiously exploring the room, whispering to one another, their faces softened by relief and burgeoning curiosity. The animals, too, had begun to relax, tails flicking, ears alert but unafraid. Daniels allowed a small smile, feeling the weight of the past night dissolve into quiet satisfaction. The room, once a capsule of fear, had become a sanctuary of hope, trust, and tentative joy. Coda's presence had been the catalyst, his calm authority transforming panic into courage, fear into connection. Daniels felt a swell of gratitude, a deep emotional resonance, as he realized that the dog had not only guided the children and animals, but had also guided him, teaching him lessons of patience, vigilance, and the subtle power of presence. He rose slowly, muscles sore but mind clear, and began to gather the remaining supplies, blankets, water bowls, and remnants of food he had brought in haste. Coda moved alongside him, sniffing, nudging, ensuring nothing was overlooked, embodying a silent, unwavering partnership. The city outside was beginning to hum with life, faint traffic sounds blending with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. Daniels felt a profound shift within himself. He had navigated the darkness, confronted danger, and emerged not just unbroken, but fundamentally changed. The note had led him here, yes, but it was Coda's guidance, his instincts, and their shared trust that had allowed him to succeed. As they prepared to leave, Daniels paused at the doorway, taking one last look at the room. The children's small faces, bright with tentative smiles, etched themselves into his memory. The animals, now relaxed, nuzzling each other and their temporary caretakers, were a testament to the resilience of life, the capacity for trust to be rebuilt even in the wake of fear. Daniels felt a lump rise in his throat, a mixture of relief, pride, and profound emotion. He knelt briefly, stroking Coda's head, feeling the dog's steady heartbeat through his palm. "We did good tonight, boy," he murmured, voice thick with unspoken gratitude. Coda responded with a soft nuzzle, tail flicking once, a silent affirmation that spoke more than words ever could. The streets outside were slick and bright with the reflection of early morning light. Daniels led the group carefully, Coda at the forefront, ensuring each child and animal navigated the wet pavement safely. The city moved around them, oblivious to the transformation that had taken place in its midst, yet Daniels felt profoundly connected to it now. Every sound, every movement, every subtle vibration beneath Coda's paws reminded him that vigilance and care could ripple outward, changing lives in ways both visible and unseen. The duo had become more than officers of law. They were guardians of fragile hope, stewards of trust, and living proof that courage could exist even in the most unassuming forms. They paused on a corner as the first rays of sun broke through clouds, illuminating the rain-slicked streets in soft, golden light. Daniels took a deep breath, the smell of wet concrete and fresh morning air filling his lungs, and allowed himself to fully absorb the scene. The children were beginning to chatter quietly, reassured by Coda's calm presence, and the animals were exploring their temporary freedom with cautious curiosity. The note in Daniel's pocket seemed almost to pulse with the significance of its role, not as an instruction, but as a catalyst for everything that had unfolded. Its words had set the chain in motion, but it was Coda's instincts, Daniel's courage, and their shared bond that had completed the mission. Daniels knelt again, looking directly into Coda's amber eyes, and felt an overwhelming wave of emotion. He realized that the night had taught him something he had long forgotten. Heroism was not measured by recognition, paychecks, or applause. It was measured in the quiet acts of protection, the small gestures of care, the unwavering presence that reassured those in need. Coda, through his patient, precise, and instinctive guidance, had embodied this truth. Daniels understood that their partnership was not just about law enforcement. It was about life itself, about responding to need, about transforming fear into courage, despair into hope. A faint breeze ruffled their hair and fur, carrying with it the scent of rain, wet asphalt, and distant trees. Daniels allowed himself to close his eyes for a brief moment, leaning into Coda's steady warmth, feeling the dog's heartbeat synchronize with his own. For weeks he had wandered through invisible struggles, feeling unseen and unappreciated. Yet now, in this soft morning light, surrounded by the lives they had touched, he felt undeniably valuable, undeniably necessary. The note had led them to this place, but the real miracle was the bond between man and dog, the seamless trust and instinct that had allowed them to navigate chaos and emerge into hope. The children waved tentatively as Daniels and Coda prepared to leave, their small gestures of gratitude humble but profound. Daniels smiled, returning the gesture, feeling the weight of responsibility ease just enough to allow the fragile bloom of satisfaction to take root. Coda nudged his hand, a reminder that their work was never truly done, but that they had made a tangible difference tonight. The officer patted the dog's head gently, then allowed the duo to step back into the city streets, the first light of day reflecting off rain-slick pavement, a cinematic tableau of quiet triumph and unspoken heroism. As they walked away, Daniels tucked the note back into his pocket, aware that its message had already fulfilled its purpose. The words would linger in his mind, not as a set of instructions, but as a reminder of why he and Coda existed in tandem, to be seen when others were not, to act when others hesitated, and to offer calm and protection in the midst of fear. Coda's tail flicked, ears alert, every muscle poised yet relaxed, embodying the essence of quiet courage. Together they moved through the city, not as invisible officers but as guardians, their bond and purpose radiating outward with each step, leaving behind a trail of lives forever changed by their presence. And as the sun rose fully, spilling golden light across wet streets and shadowed alleys, Daniels finally understood the simple, profound truth that had been whispered to him by a crumpled note, a loyal dog, and a night of peril. Being seen, ing needed and 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 acting 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 with courage 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 needed and quiet needed and acting with courage. No matter how quiet needed and acting with courage. No matter how quiet needed and acting with courage. No matter how quiet needed and acting with courage. No matter how how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet, Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. Being needed and acting with courage, no matter how quiet. No matter how small, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Coda walked beside him, steady, sure, a heartbeat against the uncertainty of the world. And in that shared moment, Daniels felt the delicate, unshakable beauty of purpose, loyalty, and life itself.